Hope springs eternal. I've long loved that phrase. I've thought about it. I have no idea why. The first time that I heard it it's actually the real title of The Shawshank Redemption. So the full title is Hope Springs Eternal, Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption. Rita Hayworth it's a reference to the poster that Andy Dufresne, which I always read as Dufresne or whatever when I read it as a kid because I don't speak French. And it's a beautiful story, and it's almost a one-to-one from the book to the movie, actually. There's very little the screenwriters actually had to do. I mean, one of the reasons that King is so easily adapted to the big screen is because he writes like a screenwriter, I've heard. Now, I looked into the actual poem where it came from, and with a lot of these things, it's written, I'm not sure which century it's written in, but it's pretty arcane. And the passage, it's a big long one, but the passage is, so it starts with, hope humbly then, with trembling pinions soar. And so it's essentially, trembling pinions refers to birds' wings, apparently. And it's suggesting that it's to approach the future with humility. So fragile, quivering wings suggests that our aspirations are delicate and uncertain and should be pursued with reverence rather than arrogance. Next line, wait, the great teacher death and God adore. So here, death is personified as the great teacher because it is the moment when all mysteries will be revealed. And until then, we need to live in reverence, in this case, to God. And death being the great teacher is interesting because, one of the things that makes us human, as opposed to animals or artificial intelligence, so to speak, is that we're aware of our own death. And it's very instructive in the sense that every intuition and every action that you have, whether subconsciously or consciously, is understanding that time is finite and that your decisions have to be made in light of that. And it works in economics too. It's a very simple idea that everything takes place in time with scarcity, subject to incentives, and that all reduces back to death and scarcity. The next line, what future bliss he gives not thee to know, but gives that hope to be thy blessing now. And essentially, it's the idea that God or the universe or whatever does not let you know what's going to happen. And it's interesting because I have this, my conception of the afterlife is that you go through this continuous loop, and every time that you hit the end, you are given the opportunity to say, what would you like to correct? What was the thing that you regret? And we'll take you back to that time, and you can correct what you thought was the problem. And then I suppose we can see the next time around. And then I think at some point you're allowed to just, sort of join the stardust if you feel, but you're always given the option to go through again. And the problem with that is that if you go back with knowledge, like, one would always think like, oh, if I went back to high school or something with all the knowledge that I have as an adult, I could absolutely lay waste to everything and I could just have the life that I've always wanted. Well, the shadow to that is that you'll be walking around knowing that none of this means anything. There's no stakes, there's no skin in the game, because you just know that, you either wait it out or jump off a bridge and you can just do it again. And nothing feels as real because you don't have that great instructor, which is death, the great teacher rather. So I had the idea that it was always that so whenever you think about intuition and sixth sense, and you seem to get some thought that comes from the divine, so to speak, just that inkling, that is the way that you can have this process communicate with you. And so when there's a moment of hesitation, this will be the thing, this idea, this is the thing that is actually your correction. But it always has plausible deniability built into it, so that it's much in the same way that the universe is deterministic, in the sense that everything is playing out exactly as it was predetermined by the Big Bang or whatever. Even though, technically speaking, yes, until the heat death of the universe, you could technically predict everything that'll happen if you had knowledge of every atom and its trajectory, and you could do the algebra. Now the computer itself will be larger than the size of the universe, yada yada yada. But the point is that technically speaking, everything is predetermined. We're never going to know it. So for all intents and purposes, I am anti-deterministic. It's a mystery. It's always going to be a mystery. And that's essentially what my theory of the afterlife is. I do realize that nothing is really worked in there about, virtue or how to live a good life or what is moral and ethical. Maybe I do presume that only good people get to do the loop again. But at the same time, I mean, maybe bad people are given the opportunity to redo some moment of injustice. You never know. Maybe we all have different arcs. But of course, this is just a thought experiment that I've had since I was a child to just sort of explain where the sixth sense comes from, if not our subconscious. And then the big line, hope springs eternal in the human breast. Man never is, but always to be blessed. Then they misspelled blessed to rhyme with... Well, no, I guess blessed, they spell it with a T. Again, this is arcane. The soul, uneasy and confined from home, rests and expatiates in a life to come. That seems like a neologism. I'm not sure if he invented a new word. But the point here is that, so it means that the human spirit naturally, endlessly generates hope, even in the face of uncertainty and suffering. That's where hope springs eternal. So you're always an engine of hope. And that is, I believe that is said by Pope here to be the God-given hope. And like, if he can't give you the future, and if he can't give you easy answers, what he can do in the way of maintaining plausible deniability, but also offering grace and guidance or whatever, you can at least get hope. That's the thing that you can always count on. And I suppose that distance from hope would be distance from God in this telling of it. And so when it says man never is, but always be blessed, so it's human beings are never fully satisfied in the present. So our sense of blessing is seemingly always projected into the future. So we live looking forward to a time when we'll be happy. So that's why joy is always just ahead, so to speak. And then it's the last line, I believe. So it's just likening the soul to an exile, uncomfortable, uneasy. I think that's what expatiates means. And trapped and confined. But either way, it's the feeling of dislocation, I suppose. But either way, so when we're talking about hope, that is the idea. It appears to be a divine gift, but even if we make this secular, it does appear to be the thing that keeps you going, even when life is terrible. And so, thinking back to the Shawshank Redemption, there is something very archetypal about it, and I never really made the connection. There's this really famous quote by a movie critic, Mike Stoklasa, where he's just like, you didn't notice, but your brain did. And so when I saw the Shawshank Redemption, it was just a story about a guy that went to prison. But in thinking about what themes it's actually showing you, so essentially what it is you've got Andy Dufresne, who, I mean, it's basically the story of Job, in the sense that the guy did everything right and then everything bad happened to him. So he ends up in prison, getting framed for murder. He's mistreated in prison. Prison is no fairy tale world, as Red says. And he eventually, he finds some joy and he finds some use, but then he ends up getting betrayed. And after a mass betrayal, he decides finally to get out of the prison. And that's where the whole famous Prison Break comes from. Now, the second half of the story is quite interesting. So you've got Red, which is Morgan Freeman's character, and essentially he tried to do all the right things when he got into prison. Good behavior. He would appeal to the parole board, and the way that he finally got out of prison was very famously he just said, like, stamp your form, let me go, don't let me go, I don't give a shit, basically. And that's when they finally let him out. So it almost seems to be kind of it seems to be a comment on the system not really wanting you healed or spiritually happy. It's more concerned with whether or not you're broken. So their definition of rehabilitation is when he becomes entirely nihilistic. Like, let me go, let me not go, whatever. And that's when they finally decide our job here is done. We've broken the man's spirit. Very, very allegorical. I mean, it actually does sort of twin 1984 in the sense that, like, the goal of the party is to make sure that you don't care, that you're in like this perfect neutral gray state where you just do whatever you're told. And prior to Red getting out of prison, we've got Brooks. Now, Brooks is very interesting because he at the time, I think it was the 50s or the 60s when he got let out of prison, but he was in prison for murder in like 1905 or something. So, he gets out in the world and he says, like, I saw like a car at the World's Fair and now they're everywhere. And he was institutionalized to the sense where I think there's a line about how, like, there is no world beyond these four walls for me now. And he is so broken by the system that he can't live outside of it. And so what he does is he just hangs himself. So he was too institutionalized, and when faced with the broad world and all the possibility, he just said, no, I give up and I'm done. And that's mirrored when Red, who is sort of the neutral, like Andy is pure hope, and then Brooks is pure desperation, is pure brokenness. And so Red comes out at a crossroads, and Red is supposed to be us. That is the audience self-insertion, because he's the narrator of the book, actually, so he is the audience. And so what he represents is you always have this choice between Andy, which, I mean, he leaves them in these instructions to find him in Mexico, and he, gives them directions. Like, so Andy is pure hope, and then Brooks is pure despair. And there's a scene where, Freeman stops off at a pawn shop, and then you see him looking at the guns. Now, there's also this is a callback. So when Andy was about to escape, he asked Red to purchase him a length of rope, or some other person in the prison that gets things. And I think Red was freaking out because it's like, don't sell a man who's just been betrayed a length of rope, for God's sakes. Like, what he's going to do with it. In the end, it turns out that he used it to like tie the documents that he used to screw the warden over in the end with to his feet when he crawled through, 500 miles of sewage in the escape. I forget the term they used, but it's very poetic. So there's always this moment where, like, and the very famous, it's time to get busy living or get busy dying, where one is given a choice. Now it's interesting because to get busy dying is actually not necessarily a reference to suicide, because you're always dying. It's never going to stop. That is mortality. So you're given the option of to just live or to just leave your life derelict. But anyway, so we got the rope being one of two things. It's a neutral instrument that can be either used for despair or hope. So Red goes to the pawn shop, and classic cinema, you see him spying all the guns, ostensibly so that he can commit a crime and then go back to prison where he's most comfortable. But what he ends up doing is purchasing a compass, which he uses to follow Andy's instructions to him to help find him in Mexico. So that's what it means. It's like hope springs eternal. It is a parable of hope. And I think about when it comes to, there's this Dasha quote, Dasha Nekrosova, who, as a podcaster, I think that she's brilliant. Her and Anna. The Red Scare episode with Tucker Carlson is probably one of the best things I've heard in the decade. And even he, like a seasoned broadcaster, journalist, professional troll, or provocateur, perhaps, even he was impressed by how good they were when they're on their game, so to speak. It's very entertaining. But she has this quote, and like, I don't know how much of this is just like Sauvignon in a solo cup, but she says, "Simply too late for me. But if you think you could ever love someone, you must take desperate measures to reach them." Now, that gets posted a lot on Valentine's Day. The quote has always stuck with me. And, having this idea about, I guess I would call it like universal relational recursion, in the sense that everything that is true for the self is true for the relationship, is true for the state, is true for larger structures. And when I think about desperate measures to reach someone, I mean, the first person that you love is yourself. And it is important to take desperate measures to reach yourself. Now, what that would mean, I suppose when it comes to the distance between people, you've got, I mean, love is a terrifying thing. And actual love and attachment basically means that you're handing somebody the keys to your heart and that they can crush you if they felt like it. It is a complete surrender to another person's ego. And there's a lot of, I mean, people spend their entire lives avoiding it because it is such a terrifying thing. And it is true, like the smarter and more sensitive and more intuitive and just the more fleshed out you are as a person, the more terrifying it gets. And the more that the leap of faith to engage in it becomes more and more daunting. And when it comes to knowing the self, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, once you know your potential, like once you've actually seen what you can do and what you're capable of, you then have a responsibility that you can't ignore to do something with it. I mean, when somebody says you have potential, it is sort of like the same as I love you, in the sense that you're being told that there's this amazing thing that might destroy you, because to not reach your potential is to really take a lot of damage, is to feel a lot of pain. If you've got, like, I mean, I suppose the world is like that. Anything that's worth doing is risky. Anything that is powerful can go either way. It can be destructive or it can be beneficial. And so people begin to wall themselves off. That is where that is actually where tyranny begins, is within the self. And so you've got the ability to make a prison of your own life, much in the same way, like if we're thinking about the Shawshank Redemption, like we're talking about a prison. So, you know, you can become Brooks in the sense that the prison is comforting and it is the thing that you know the most. And it is a very rigid architecture that you can stick within, and at least it's consistent. And many people are very unhappy. And this is kind of the story of consciousness and the world in that people will absolutely choose safety over ambiguity. Like that's a very classic thing, and it definitely sneaks up on you. And then you can think about it, like in the relational sphere, you can definitely wall yourself off from the gaze of another person, from entwining yourself in another person. Same with the government. And I suppose, I mean, it finds you. So it's a lot of times it's quite predatory. But alternative systems of government that might be better, one could say voluntarism, no government at all, still organized. I can't harp on that enough. Like still law bringing and justice serving, but just not in a theft-ridden and crushing way to you. People wall themselves off from the better way of being. And I suppose too, like with the divine, with the sort of collective unconsciousness of morality, people absolutely will distance themselves from their responsibility to their fellow man in a deep and existential sense. They will abdicate that as well by, again, building a prison. And when we're talking about taking desperate measures to reach somebody, what we're really talking about is, how do you know when you or they are worth it? That is the question that has really been, like, in order to go to desperate measures, you begin with, if you think you could ever love something, someone, the world, you must take desperate measures to reach it. So there is the article of hope that it's worth it. And so with yourself, if you think that you actually have potential, I mean, there is the call to take desperate measures to reach yourself. And I mean, how do you know? Well, I mean, you'll always have this inkling that you're obviously not in the right place. You're in a prison of your own making. You are beholden to a structure that does not recognize your humanity. And it's same with relationships in the sense like, yeah, you know that this could go somewhere with another person, and you know that the only reason that you resist it is because of the draw and how powerful it is. And then with all systems of government, I mean, it is, you know how much better the world could be. Like you know that your groceries doubling in price every 5 years is not the way, is a crime against nature. And you know that. And every time that you avoid it, you know that you're betraying yourself. So that is the idea about desperate measures, about hopeful measures towards something that that matters. That is why the quote sticks with me so much, because it's great things are never in a single register. They echo across everything. Everything is a fractal. And I mean that in a very specific way, which I've just outlined, but it's not just theory to me. Now, the methods that people use to create these prisons. So within the self, you've got sort of these self-fulfilling prophecies and narratives and distancing. And I mean, psychiatry or psychology is ultimately what it serves. If it's not serving breaking down your internal prison, it's not really serving anything. You know, you can think of, it's like Freudian analysis and just sitting in a couch for decades. But this idea of navel gazing and just talking about your problems to a wall forever, it really has to be an actionable thing. You actually have to see results from it. Now, from my amateur perspective, cognitive behavioral therapy appears to actually have the bloody results to it. And there's all these things about cognitive behavioral therapy is basically epistemology. It's simply applying logic to a complex world and understanding the biases that are inherent to human consciousness. So catastrophizing and black and white thinking. I mean, honestly, the Dummies book to cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the best resource on it. You can read the Wikipedia page. And I mean, that in and of itself, if an entire school of psychiatry can be written down in a simple book for people that is easily understandable and actionable immediately, that is a pretty good endorsement about how good it is. And I can endorse it myself. And the other thing with cognitive behavioral therapy is it's I believe it's the origin, or at least uses heavily exposure response therapy. And that is to say that one of the ways to avoid creating these prisons within yourself and everywhere, so let's just say like the universal panopticon or something like that, one of the ways to avoid it is in conversation and dialogue. Now, it can be dialogue with people where you're actually engaged with opposing views. You're not just talking at somebody. You're in a conversation where both people in good faith are presenting their arguments and you're considering them. And like dialogue is precious when you do it in good faith, because it's the only way that you have your ideas challenged and you have exposure to new ideas, and you have to test and explain your own ideas. I mean, half the reason that I do these is just to say what I believe out loud so that my friends who exist not just to smuggle my own opinions into this and establish consensus. These are real people that send me very, very long and very specific messages about things. But to actually have your own ideas tested. And with exposure response, like just going out into the world as such, like you're negotiating with the world. I think of that Mike Tyson quote about how everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Well, everyone has a view of the world until they actually go into the world. Now, one of my friends who is actually, he's far more into philosophy than I am. Like he went really deep. He has sort of an obsession with semiotics. But his whole thing was he had this arc where he went in very deep to it. And then at some point when he was debating with people, and I mean, I've had this too, where it's just like you have people with very complex systems and very complex ideas, but you're looking, what are they actually doing with it? You know, and then eventually we came to both of us sort of came to this conclusion that like we were arguing about the nature of beauty with people who had dirty fingernails. We were talking about the world with people that don't experience it. They live in their basement. You know, one of my friend's favorite sayings is just like, you know, I know that you like talking about Heidegger and all this crap, and like I'm sure that it's very interesting to you. Would you ever just go out for a slice of pizza with a girl? Honestly, could you do that? Like, I don't trust anybody that doesn't actually go out into the world and test their hypotheses, people that don't leave their insular group and test their hypotheses. It is quite a famous thing. Like I've had multiple friends that were very deep into sort of cultic Christian upbringings, and they had very complex. They had like their own lingo, and they had the self-contained ideas, and they had a response for everything. Everything was walled off for them. They had the Bible, which was interpreted by the elders in their own ways that served their own purposes, and they were very much enraptured in this. However, once they left home, a great amount of effort had to be projected by the families to make sure that these people stayed in line. Because once they got out into the real world and started interacting with people, they realized that this sort of eschatological thing where it's just like, the world is Babylon and the family is Eden or whatever, that every opposing view is satanic Luciferian knowledge, kind of blew apart once they actually interacted with this so-called evil world and realized that most people are, at the basic level, they all want the same things, and they can have their better nature appealed to. And it is not a matter of evil. Because I've said this about governments, in the sense that the more dysfunctional the government, the more that you, one, have to rely on the population being homogenous, and two, there always being an outside threat. So, I mean, diversity shows up once it can actually bear the cost of it, because people have to be organized by something greater than themselves. So for me, that's liberty and libertarianism. I don't really recognize any identity beyond, do you believe in human rights? Do you believe in freedom? Do you believe in the inherent dignity of the individual? There's no identity beyond that. There's that, and then there's tyranny. And there's aggression. And those are the only two things that I recognize. And in those insular systems, I mean, it was obviously tyranny because the individual was overwritten. That is essentially what happened. The purpose of religion in those families was to cloister and to stop people from discovering themselves, and then discovering themselves in relation to their families, and then in relation to the greater superego around them. And that is the really horrible part, because all these tools of good, so psychiatry and religion and neuroscience and government and civil thought and economics, like all of the theories are essentially languages of tyranny, because the whole point is that you overwrite people's instincts and their knowledge with sort of these ersatz versions that only serve power. So 9 times out of 10, like it's very famous. Well, not famous, but it's. I've always thought that, like, for most of your life, when somebody says, "Who are you? What are you doing?" They're not asking that in a magnanimous way. They're saying, "Who the hell are you to question me? And what the hell are you doing? That is not the thing that I want you to do." And it's the same thing with philosophy. The point of philosophy is to masquerade as truth. Like in practical terms, philosophy is meant to masquerade as truth. So to increase the virulence and the adoption of these self-imposed Gnostics, philosophy is used as a way to say any opposing view to the groups is suspect. So if you think about when you're a kid, I mean, like when an adult says, like, "Who the hell are you to question me?" That is basically what philosophy really is used for. Nothing is absolute. So an outside opinion, or opinion that I don't like, something that threatens the walls of this prison, you see, that's when we start getting into the territory of, like, well, what is language? What is the self? I mean, you're asking this question, who even are you? And there's always implicit in that statement that everything is suspect except the person that is questioning. So if you act in the world, like you adopt a moral philosophy by your very actions, it's a de facto moral philosophy. If you act in a certain way, that is your morality. So it's sort of the classic tautological, I suppose it's a paradox, but nothing is absolute. Well, that statement is an absolute statement, and that's not something to be laughed off. That is essentially what is being used. So we think about the basement dweller, And what is he using philosophy for? And essentially it is just, I can't face my fears unless I have a perfect system ahead of time. That's it. That's all that they're really doing. Like all the people that talk about Heidegger and all the people that talk about the demiurge and, how the world is actually a false reality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just I'm uncomfortable leaving the basement and talking to people and risking getting hurt and having to be broken apart and then reformulate myself. But, people are like bones. If you break them, they become stronger afterwards. And it's just, all of that can be eliminated by just exposure response therapy. You need to gather data, like lived, embodied data of the world outside where you are. And you would think that only applies to basement dwellers in their teens and 20s, but it applies to every person at all points in all times. And there is this thing when you become older, and I've noticed this, we can just make this like a brassy, idiotic take on boomers. But it's just, once you've been doing the same thing for 20 years, you'll want to continue doing that, even if the world around you has changed tremendously, because it's what you know and it's what's familiar. And what the point of philosophy and psychology should be, and just general inquisition, is to just always leave yourself open to being changed. And so even if you're not leaving the house and doing a billion things, even to just make sure that your mind doesn't become calcified by your experience and what you think that you know. And that learning is it's always going to be a difficult process. It should feel bad before it feels good. And with moral philosophy, like I'll give an example, and this was actually something that I left off of my last one. And so if we think about the rights of children, this is sort of a response to, I suppose, imposing rigid categories, but also this is a perfect anti-authoritarian thing to think about. So say that I don't know how it depends on how old you are, but say that you didn't do your science homework and you get spanked or belted or hit or something, or, you have all of your toys taken away or something like that because you didn't do science homework. Okay. So if we can imagine, the justification for that is that, so children are under the parental auspices. They're owned by the parents. And the parents also have a responsibility to ensure that the children grow up having a sense of responsibility, in this case about science homework. So let's look at the morality of that. So the first idea is that the child is cognitively not equipped to make adult decisions. Therefore, they do not need to be negotiated with, or intimidated, whatever, but not negotiated with. So let's apply that to an adult that has diminished mental capacity. So say that you've got somebody that's really deep in Alzheimer's disease and they do something you don't like. If you start smacking them around or you start revoking their privileges, that would be considered a crime. That is a really big deal to abuse the elderly. Except we have this moral reversal where children who are, and it's even worse because yes, they have diminished mental capacity, but at the same time, they're far more sensitive, and their self is being constructed at the time. So like the amount of danger of a horrible dynamic being infused and projected in their entire adulthood, it's sort of like Red in the grocery store, like that sort of partial institutionalization where you can't even go to the bathroom without asking for permission. The consequences are horrible. Now, as well, if we're talking about like even like corporal punishment or even punitive damages, so like having your property taken away, so that's like you getting a fine as an adult, like a speeding ticket or something. Well, I mean, if you're 17 years old, 364 days, 23 hours, and whatever, right? You can have your property taken away legally and it can be smacked around, but like at the stroke of midnight on your birthday, you become an adult, and thus the belting becomes assault. And if someone is to have punitive damages against you, that's a whole process. Like there's laws around that. You got to go to court. You have to get like a lien. You have to go to a debt collection agency. Like there's all these rules and regulations that are separated by, the stroke of midnight. And so you can see where the moral instruction is kind of useless. And there's a very good reason that people don't want to engage with this, when they don't want to admit that children have rights and that children need to be protected. I mean, we've got, the foster system. I mean, that's a whole other thing. And we've got, child protective services, but they really only come in at the point where like an adult would be, would be entitled to hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages for emotional stress and, damages on that regard. So you can see why people really don't want to crack that door open on morality, because it implicates them. And it means that their whole system needs to be reconfigured. But, I having hope in children being raised peacefully and with dignity, and in a way that has them recognize their own rights, and then they're strong enough to recognize other people's rights. And then we can begin to reconstruct the world based on people that actually just have a sense of dignity. Because the reason that you mistreat people politically, and the reason that you mistreat people in relationships, is because your earliest map of morality and relation is determined by oftentimes a really shitty childhood. So when we talk about moral reversal in parents, there is a very common experience people have when they approach their parents and say, the things that you did to me growing up affected me severely, and I want to tell you that they're wrong. And I need to say that because if I allow somebody to do something like this to me and I don't say anything about it, it makes it permissible. It's to my subconscious, it tells me that this is the way that I can be treated. And if I don't fight back, if I don't at least name the thing that's been done to me, then I will continue to tolerate that behavior on an ongoing basis. Something like that. I mean, heck, it could even actually be damages that you're seeking. You're asking for some kind of compensation. Who knows? It depends on how bad it was. Because again, if you think about an adult who gets subjected to abuse and gaslighting and just dysfunctional dynamics, there is a right to be compensated for it in one way or another, even if it is just a simple acknowledgement. And so what parents will often say is they will say, well, we did the best we could. We had limited information. We were new parents. We didn't know what we were doing. All fair and good. And I understand that. However, when you're a kid and you haven't done the science homework. Now, first of all, this is a very specific memory for me because I remember it was something about balancing equations in chemical reactions that I didn't do and I got punished for it. Okay. So first of all, I have never used those equations in my adulthood ever. And that goes for a lot of things in my scholastic experience. So first we have the fact that I never actually ended up using this. But I spent countless hours in classroom instruction learning how to do this thing that turned out to be completely useless. And when it was at the time, it was revealed to my parents that I didn't do the science homework and they were really pissed off. Where was my ability to say, well, I did the best I could. I'm only 14 years old. I have limited information. I'm new to this. I'm new to this just as you. However, they have the right to punish me. So they both have the right to expose me to the science homework and to punish me. So if ethics are actually going to apply to people universally, if you did that to an adult, if you kidnapped an adult and stuck him in a science class at the age of 25, and you made him learn the equations and you made him do the work, and if he didn't do the work, then, it's like you smack him around, you take away his stuff, you ground him, which is, kidnapping and property seizure and all of this for something that they ended up not needing in the first place. Where is your ability to say exactly what they say to you in their excuse for doing that to you? Now, this is not an invocation of everybody hate your parents and destroy the family unit and whatever. That's not really the way the world works. The past is past. And I only say that in the sense that you should not use the past as a self-fulfilling prophecy, that you should not constantly think that the things that happened to you in the past need to persist in the future. That is not what I'm invoking. It is more the first process where like just call out the wrong in the first place. And then the redemptive act is to be in a position of authority over somebody else and actually treat them like a human being this time. That is when, if you have children, you actually, I mean, this is a radical idea, but you actually ask them what interests you. And you start having to develop that idea of like, you know, I respect you enough and your motivations enough that I can start teaching you this process of how to find out what you love and what you want to do with your life and what your actual proclivities are, what actually interests you. Now, for me, it was this stuff. It was everything but science homework. It was everything but balancing equations. I have no interest in chemistry whatsoever. But all that I'm really asking on behalf of my childhood self is just fucking ask me. And that is what I would say to anybody that's going to have kids or has kids, is just fucking ask them. Treat them like they are adults. Treat them like they are adults that like got in a car accident and they've got like diminished frontal lobe capacity. If you want to believe yourself to be a steward of this developing mind. And, you know, it's a fair point. But again, like, it's an adult has the right to have their preferences heard. And to have their humanity acknowledged. And in every relationship, make sure that you're maintaining that. Because, you know, like, you have power over children, but you have power over friends, and you have power in your relationships. In fact, the more that somebody looks up to you and loves you, or is entwined with you, or is in a relationship of high stakes with you, so increases your responsibility to treat them with the humanity that they deserve. That is all that I'm asking for in terms of relational schema. It is not some thing about like putting parents in prison or suing them for millions of dollars. Like, you know, I'm a practical guy. I know that society at large is never going to accept that. And in fact, I mean, the society that we have may be a bit too punitive to begin with, or a bit too litigious to begin with. That's all that we're really asking. Just like I have all these essays that are just like a return to just relation, which is to just have some moral consistency and some ethical consistency in every relationship, because that is the only way that the world heals. Children that are actually asked what they want and what motivates them as children are more likely to do that as adults. There is no getting around that. There's no sidestepping that. And I've seen it firsthand. Like, I know that everybody thinks that you're some fucking Spartan general and you're going to raise your kids in a pit and they're going to be tough because you've stripped them of their agency. Well, no, you turn them into tyrants and you make them predigested for tyrants. Okay. Like, you are continuing the system by abusing children in this way. And furthermore, when it comes to those walls that you place within yourself, like this idea about procrastination being like, okay, if you think about every time that you had to do something as a kid, there was always a threat behind it. So, you know, either like your parents would become destabilized, or you'd have something taken away, or you'd lose privileges. And the thing is like, if you think about as an adult, I mean, you're motivated by positive reinforcement. And one of these things that was memories that was sort of indirectly instructional was, I remember I was getting a ride to work from a family friend, and the whole time, like, he's an engineer, he's a very smart guy, but he's very narrowly focused, and he's very high energy. I wouldn't say ADD, but it's something approximating it. And while he was driving me, he just keeps changing the radio station like every 5 seconds. And then he just like turns and gives me life advice. And he's like, listen, this is the way that life is. Like, it's just, you know, you get a job and then you get a better job and then you get a better job and a better job and a better job. All right. And then you get a good apartment and then you get a better apartment and then you get a house and you get a bigger house. And it's just, you just keep going at it. And that's what life's all about. And, you know, it was true in the sense that life is an escalation. Now, I think ideally, and for me, it's more about raising the stakes and your life being more spiritually congruent with what you love to do and what your values are. And you develop more responsibility and you have more agency to actually cause deep and holistic effects in people's lives. So most of your first jobs will be just working in warehouses or retail or some kind of clerical position that is just barely replaceable by a machine. You don't have a lot of agency and you don't engage in the power process. Like, ideally the jobs are more close to what you would actually do and love when you get up in the morning, and the reciprocity between people, like you're really making an effect on people. And that is sort of the spiritual wealth that you orient yourself towards. Like that is the hopeful conclusion. You're always going to need to eat, but you may as well do so in a way that nourishes both the soul, the bank account, and the body. The most motivating things is when you actually have a positive valence, when you can picture something great happening. That I mean, if you want to talk about hope, that is the thing. It's not fear of, like, if you think about, like, you know, going back to that friend of mine trying to have kids, you can think about all the wonderful things I can do with my family when I actually land this amazing job, versus the kind of jobs that you try to go for. It's just like, I'm going to die. I'm not going to be able to pay rent. The debt collectors are calling me. I've had to change my number. Negative motivation is obviously just depressing, and it's a whole desperate process. So when you're growing up and you're getting nothing but negative reinforcement associated with tasks, well, as an adult, it's this Pavlovian thing where instead of salivating, you resist it, because the human being naturally resists being overwritten, being overtaken, and you lose motivation because it reinforces this idea that the world is nothing but punishment. And so basic tasks become a matter of punishment. And now, like, we're talking about like exposure response therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, the way to do things is to do them. And there's no system beyond that. I mean, that is one of my greatest problems. Was I was really obsessed with getting things done, like the system, and just all these motivational systems and organizational systems where you write everything down. And, you know, ultimately, I recognize the one insight that I got from the getting things done was they have this thing called the bucket, which is just like this giant list of shit you have to do. And you write it down so that it stops circulating in whatever part of the brain constantly reminds you of tasks, as a way to clear up mental space. The other thing was, if a task can be completed under 5 minutes, you just do it. It's as simple as that. And what happens is you begin to realize that when you do things, what happens is that you feel good after you've done something, and you begin the process of positive reinforcement. So if you're having trouble getting started in your day, you literally just do all the 5-minute tasks you can possibly think of. And you build on that momentum. I mean, you start getting far more neurotransmitter release the minute that you start doing things. But the idea is, like, act first and then feel it later. It's sort of like pumping your legs in a swing set, or like, you know, your car starting on a winter morning, right? It's going to suck at first, but then everything gets done. It's simple as that. Like, if I have a bunch of work to do, the first thing that I do is do a bunch of work. And I mean, I guess I find that dumb tasks, like just doing your laundry or cleaning the kitchen, like something that doesn't require like a lot of cognitive strength, those are the best things to start with. So like every morning I just like clean everything up and then I leave the house, ideally. So, but that's the idea. So like we can start off with the fact that procrastination. And what do people procrastinate on the most is confronting their personal prisons. What people procrastinate most is confronting the hope that is burning within them. What procrastination is to, you know, absorb more knowledge. This idea of like philosophy and self-help being just, I can't do the thing, so I can simulate doing the thing by reading things about doing the thing. And that is a pure no bueno in every possible regard. It is just a matter of exposure and response. And, you know, I've always been a fan of, I don't know why I think this, but like consciousness, subconscious. The consciousness, the subconscious always seemed to be in the back of the head, and the consciousness seemed to be in the front of the head. And years ago, I came across Ian McGilchrist, and he has this theory about the hemispheres of the brain. And it was literally and figuratively mind-blowing, because I've been obsessed with this idea of this just north and south of the human brain and the interaction between the two. And I'd never really given much thought to the hemispheres. And when we're talking about these self-imposed prisons, and we're talking about these sort of Pavlovian responses to the world and the misuse of philosophy, it's The book that started it all was something called The Master and His Emissary. And I wouldn't recommend reading the book because there is this thing with intellectuals, like he's a brilliant man and he's obviously done a lot of work and a lot of novel work and a lot of inspirational work. But there's something to be said, like in debate and when you're making a point, to engage with the other side, to engage with counter arguments. That's the one thing that I always got like a lot of shit in my writing from instructors was I never engaged the other side well enough or thoroughly enough. Now, with him, the book could be maybe a half the length, and it could use a hell of a lot more analogies. And he just spends so much time engaging with engaging with objections or making clarifications. And it's not that he's engaging the other side; it's more that he's seemingly trying to preempt these ridiculous midwit bad faith takes. Because the thing about science and intellectuals is like. People hate not being the smartest person in the room, and it takes a lot of inner work and a lot of meditation and a lot of experience with the world and yourself to not have to constantly always be the smartest person in the room. Because you have to let yourself go, you have to let yourself feel, you have to let yourself actually absorb other people's opinions. And the science community is full of those people that he writes something brilliant and they're like, oh, I'm threatened. So I'm going to toss an actually at him and point out some small mistake. And then he is now trained to constantly engage with this distracting narrative. But when you're excessively defending yourself preemptively, you are actually losing yourself to the midwit actually people by the very nature of you diluting your own point. And so I wouldn't read the book because it's incredibly hard to follow because of this. And you're going to want to wait for secondary analysis. So if you can get like the Dummy's Guide to the Brain Hemispheres or the Dummy's Guide to His Master and Emissary, perfect. So the way to explain it analogistically is to say that the left hemisphere of the brain is obsessed with structure. It is obsessed with categorizing and quantifying things and putting them into stable structures, whereas the right hemisphere is the one of relation and ambiguity and allows yourself to see the world as a continuous process. And I'm already losing you, which is why analogy is so wonderful here. So if you think about it this way, you can imagine that you're going on a date, and to go on that date, first of all, you've got date, which is just, it is a flattening of what's actually happening. Because a date is basically everything from the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe, because it all takes place in the universe. So like that date can be traced back to the Big Bang and millions of years and the cooling of the earth on which the date happens. And then like the birth and death and recycle and Kali Yuga of the people involved. And there are people in process, and they're always learning and they're always changing. And like, it's a very sort of open-ended thing, because once you say date or person or pen, you are reducing something to a flattened version of what it actually is. And I mean, that's completely necessary to move around in the world. Like, you need a floor on which to stand. You can't just be suspended in ambiguous air. So to go on this date, you're going to say, we're going to meet at this location. And this location is the world segmented into latitude and longitude and places and locations. And it takes place in time. So 12 p.m. means nothing, objectively. It is a structure that is imposed upon the world. And then the right hemisphere is the thing that can handle ambiguity, which sees things as continuous, as I've said. So, for instance, when you go to meet the person on the date, you don't think of the date as like her name, you don't freeze her in time. She's not just a pawn on a chessboard. That is, and she exists in relation to you, and you exist in relation to her. And like, a relationship cannot be measured. Love cannot be measured. Connection cannot be measured. A person cannot be measured. And in fact, his whole deal is that the world is suffering because we've become too left hemispheric in the way that we perceive things that ought to be right hemispheric. Now, the reason it's called the master and his emissary is because the master is the right hemisphere, ideally, which sees the world as a whole and then uses the left hemisphere to crush it into into things it can manipulate. And they talk about like it's sort of like how the left hemisphere, like every creature is bilateral. The brains are bilateral. So the one that I always remember is like a bird, and so the bird needs its left hemisphere to check between rock and seed, because again, rock and seed, arbitrary definitions, but it still needs to do that. And then it's got the right hemisphere, which is perceiving the entire world sort of unfiltered. And it can go both ways, but essentially what it is like if the left hemisphere is leading the charge, that is the emissary turning on the master. Because if you're viewing the world from a more left hemispheric perspective, you tend to crush and flatten things. And actually, the prison that people have within themselves and between each other is inherently a left hemispheric process. So when you believe that the prison walls are all that you will ever be, when you attach to them objective weight, like the restrictions that you have internally and between other people and vis-a-vis you and the government, that is a left hemispheric conception. And he talks about how that is essentially the root of tyrannical governance. I mean, for me, it really struck me because my whole thing is this dichotomy between econometrics and socialist planning and the free market. And the free market is sort of like the master in the sense that the economy only works if it's free people freely bidding between all goods in the economy at all times. And this is the heart of the economic calculation debate. So this is like Keynes v. Hayek, where these spontaneous relationships, they can't be measured and crushed, because when you have a 5-year plan where you decide like, more cars should be made than tractors, you're essentially freezing the world into an image, and it's an image that you want, and it is an image that is not necessarily taking into account the relationships, all the relationships between people, because in order to left hemispherically conceptualize an economy, it's one of those things. It's like trying to deterministically model the universe, in the sense that the factors that actually maintain an economy and a people and a culture, they cannot be crushed into a model, because the model will always be incomplete. It's sort of like the difference between like a color photograph and a 10th generation black and white photocopy. Yes, it is an image of the thing, but obviously the left hemispheric view is something that has been crushed for expediency. Now, there is something to be said about, like, say that you have a picture of a ruler and you have it on like Zeiss lenses and it's on 35 millimeter film and it's like done in your basement in your own dark room. Okay, but for a ruler, a black and white photocopy would be preferred, because there's no parallax, there is no distortion from the gel print. It's just a very precise process. And so both have their uses. I mean, when it comes to entrepreneurial calculation, you are going to have to crush the economy into your little piece of it, and you have to measure it in dollars and cents. And even currency itself is a left hemispheric tool. However, it is the thing that allows you to figure out profit and loss, and thus you can actually use a left hemispheric tool, which is currency, provided it maintains its value across time. I cannot emphasize this enough. Provided it maintains the value across time, you can use this left hemispheric tool to at least have some way of knowing if in this soup and universe and mishigas of the right hemisphere is actually being worked within in a way that is actually benefiting you. Because I mean, benefit is a, like, profit is a loosey-goosey thing in the right hemisphere, but you can get approximations with a left hemispheric economic view. But the thing is that central planning tends to be more left hemisphere, because there's this thing about how the reason you don't want to be led by the left hemisphere is because it only knows itself and doesn't know what it doesn't know, and tends to be very self-referential and can't really accept new information, which is, I mean, it is the schema of trauma and self-erasure and self-defeat is when you just decide that the model that you have of yourself is accurate and cannot tolerate ambiguity. And it's the same thing with economic activity. Like you're tolerating ambiguity, but you're also using some tools to at least try to find your way in the world, much like you find the floor. And so, yeah, we're talking about subconscious and conscious. Well, I mean, the hemispheres, when I listened to those interviews with Ian McGilchrist and took a look at the book, I mean, like, I read the book, but it's sort of like, that thing in Fish Called Wanda, like monkeys can read philosophy, Otto, but they can't necessarily understand it. So, I mean, I think that I think there's potential for the hemisphere theory to be misused, like absolutely. It's kind of like Marx, where it's ambiguous enough where, the Soviets, like, so Das Kapital and the actual, like, the penguin version of Marx and Engels' work is actually not that big. But the libraries of the Soviet interpretations of Marx and Engels, that was libraries upon libraries, because it's sort of like a generative thing where if it's ambiguous enough, you can twist the language around enough to justify whatever the hell you want. And the Bible is the same way, in the sense that things have different meanings, and there's hermeneutics where you're looking at the words and what they meant at the time. I mean, the classic example of this is the Second Amendment, and it's just like, oh my God, like if you want to talk about like bad faith interpretation, it's just like shall not be infringed has meant the same thing since like, Proto-Germanic tribes, the 1200s, while walking around, like shall not be infringed. Like, what part of that don't you understand? I don't and we're determining barrel lengths and we're determining magazine capacities and just like, I feel so sorry for the Yanks, because it's just, I tend to be on board with Lysander Spooner, and he was very famous for the Constitution of No Authority, where he said, like, listen, man, like, it's sort of like a Glenn Campbell thing where like some ink stains dried up on a line do not a country make. Because history of jurisprudence and the American experience is like, these rights are inalienable, and then somebody's saying, yeah, but I don't wanna. That's it. That I've saved you 400 years of history. So we're talking about hope. And what hope means, I believe, in the practical sense, is just the idea that you're more than your current circumstances. And this actually applies everywhere to all ages. It is a universal human ethic in the sense that you are absolutely beyond your current circumstances. And, the wisdom that I can offer is that there's always, I had a friend refer to it as like a stuck in a place, just in the sense that you're walled off and can't really see beyond the situation that you're presently mired in. And the only way to fight that overarching feeling that, yes, my situation is the only thing that I'm ever going to know, and there's no breaking out of it, and the despair, first of all, have reverence for despair in other people, and understand that it's a very compelling thing to do, because we're all about survival and safety. And so if you're sticking yourself in a box, there's a very coherent and very ancient sort of evolutionary reason for that. It's just fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn, or whatever. It's just that was a survival mechanism. Like, stick with what you know because you've survived that. And so you've got this idea that just stay there. That's the most survivable thing. And when we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy and we talk about this exposure response therapy, when we talk about the right hemisphere being the one that accepts ambiguity and can see the whole picture, it is a paradoxical idea with exposure response therapy, because it is essentially something that you're afraid of is a signal that you should face it. So fear, a survival mechanism, is actually going to be a symptom of the fact that you should actually face that. And when you have the hemispheres working in concert, what you can do is, when you're talking about the thing that that scares you, you can investigate whether or not that fear exists. There's this Gary Busey quote where he's like, you know what fear stands for, don't you? It stands for false evidence appearing real. And what you get from that is the sense that, I mean, some fear is good, but it needs a left hemispheric investigation. So that's when you start considering statistics. And statistics are like an ambiguous, open, continuous process that have been crushed down to a structure for the sake of investigating it and determining its truth. And so when you got this, if you're afraid of something, whether or not you should face it, well, you can say, okay, so fear of skydiving. You can say, well, skydiving is this lethal. You're afraid of free climbing, that is climbing up a mountain or a cliff face without any protective gear, right? You're afraid of that, but the left hemispheric view will tell you, well, that's stupid because those people famously die and you have to be an elite athlete in order to do that. And like, I should be afraid of that for good reason. However, if you were talking about, say, phoning somebody for a job or going somewhere that is open and ambiguous, like if you're meeting people or somebody in open water, like if you're engaging with the system outside of your safety and comfort zone. But if it's just a social thing, I mean, there's this saying I really like: worse things happen at sea. It's actually, I got it from a Jethro Tull song, "Nothing is easy." But just the idea that, like, if the fear is not based on anything that can actually harm you, I mean, there's your first thing. Like, going to a party is not going to hurt you. Free climbing very well might. Going into the tiger enclosure in the zoo, almost guaranteed. It's a healthy fear response. And there's another thing, too, to understand that you have to switch your view of what a fearful confrontation can be. In the sense that, like, I have this thing constantly where I'm like, I don't want to go to a fucking party. I don't want to talk to people. I don't want to listen to them. I don't want to have to share a bathroom with 30 people. I don't want to think about how long has that potato salad been out of the fridge. I don't want to go there. I don't want to walk there. I don't want to drive there. I don't want to take the train there. I'm going to feel gross. And I'm like 5 pounds heavier than last time that I wore these pants. And I'm just going to be uncomfortable the whole time. And just like, you can talk yourself out of just everything. And then after the billionth time that I've gone and I'm going home and I'm just elated with like how inspired I am that I've went out and had all these new experiences. I mean, some of my best memories have come. It's weird. There's this thing like the parties themselves are amazing, but it's always the afterglow. And like one of my greatest memories is, walking home at 6 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the summer. I mean, the party itself was insane, like mind bending, and not necessarily because of any adulterants, but yeah, just like that walk home, like, Mars and Venus were in the sky and it's just like this perfect like aquamarine dawn. I mean, that was the greatest memory. And here was like this party that I thought, I don't want to go to this. Like the greatest things happen at those things. And you've just got to go, because this is the way that you're reforming your subconscious perception of what it means to risk things. Your Pavlovian response to actually engaging with the world and to engage in dialogue with the world and other people is just, you have to constantly have this retraining of, it was going to suck. I swore it was going to be terrible. And then it felt amazing. And, tyrannical systems rely and they increase your fear. So with my friends in their little eschatological doom cults, end of the world, the whole world is Babylon. Everyone's sinful. They're going to take you and tear you apart and all that crap. They feed on you not leaving those systems by training you to think of ambiguity as dangerous, to think of risk of going out. Like they try to take low risk things and then give you a left hemispheric architecture that says, this is actually a high risk thing. You will sin and you will betray yourself and you will do all these terrible things that you can't take back. Now, one of the ways to ensure that you don't do terrible things when you leave the house is that you train people, or rather allow them to see that they are people with human rights and they are deserving of dignity. So if you're talking about like letting your kid go to a party, or even you going to a party, well, you can go to a trap house and smoke crack, or You can go have a glass of wine with sophisticated people who have jobs and families and plans and horizons, right? So it's all about teaching people to respect themselves. And once they respect themselves, they don't end up in these terrible situations. And this is the really tragic thing, is that like a lot of these people that grew up in Christian systems like this, and I just say Christian because, well, I'm an Albertan, and you know, just that's kind of our big thing in a lot of ways. But just people that grew up in these cultic systems, the problem is that when they finally have their what do the Amish call it, the Rumspagen or whatever, where you go into the world, is that you've been ground down to a nub, and you've been told all your instincts are wrong, and you've been told that ambiguity is terrible and all this. And like you've had yourself destroyed so that the system can consume you. And so when you finally freak the fuck out in your mid-20s and you just say, fuck it, I'm going to go to town and I'm going to do all the things that I've been neglecting. Well, that is when you run into trouble, because you, as a person that have no sense of self, walk into this world, you're taken advantage of by anybody. Like you're predigested by the parental and institutional system to be open to being torn apart. And this happens a lot in a lot of these dysfunctional families, where somebody finally leaves the house and then they get destroyed as predicted, and then they come back, and like this is the prodigal son. This is the example. You see what happens when you leave the system. And this is the same thing for governments. Like, you know, you have people on welfare for generations, and then you take a welfare program away, and then, you know, people are generations away from productive work in society. And like the necessary skills to like have and maintain jobs and education. So yes, if you have a dependent class of people, you're damaging them. And then it can always be used as an internal justification for these tyrannical measures. It's the same thing with, you know, the permanent war countries. You know, they have tyrannical systems, so they're open, like they're consumed with infighting, which allows intelligence agencies and outside influence and militaries to go in and destabilize the place. But their destabilization is used as an infinite pretext for external tyrannical systems. So it all scales. And, you know, I often think about how the Bible, if you notice, it starts off really tyrannical and parental. Like it's just, you do this and you'll be smitten or smited immediately. Like there's immediate consequences to your actions. And as it progresses to the New Testament, you begin to see God and the Holy Spirit, or whichever it is. I'm not really a theologian, but it tends to be more of a faith-based approach. You know, I in the sense that like perhaps God just realized that people living under fear are not really people. They don't have plausible deniability. They don't it's almost like he thought that people were becoming more nihilistic the more that he announced himself. Because I just think about I think it's Cain and Abel, but the whole thing where like going up to a mountain to cut your kid's head off to be in God's favor. That's the kind of thing that happens to people when you have an authority that is omnipresent and is there with immediate consequences. Whereas it almost seems to me, in my amateur interpretation, that even from a secular perspective, it seems to be this idea of personal and societal development, that things need to be based on hope more so than direct feedback, because the nihilism of knowing that nothing means anything because someone can always take it away from you, like this tyrannical overlord, sort of like well, I mean, I wouldn't say tyrannical overlord. I would just say the Old Testament God. But the point is that like it's almost like he realized that human thriving only happens when we rely on hope rather than consequence. And when I think about philosophy and psychiatry, and I think about words between people, the idea that just comes to me is just to not find perfect systems or to find perfect architectures. Your schema and your relationship to the world, I think, should be tolerant of ambiguity and should embrace change, but still be bridled by some kind of bearing. It's all about, it is about balance. And when it comes even to me, like as somebody that writes a lot and is engaged in systems and has very, very, very well thought out, not necessarily right, but well thought out theses on things, I just have to keep reminding myself it's a matter like, don't find the words, find the person.